Elena Mercer was halfway through reviewing post-op reports at the hospital when her phone buzzed with a call she hadn't seen in months. "Mom." The name alone brought a familiar weight to her chest. She hesitated before answering, instinctively bracing herself for what favor might follow the overly sweet voice on the other end. "Elena, darling," Beatrice cooed. "We're having a family dinner next weekend. Everyone will be there. It's been too long." The warmth in her voice sounded practiced, almost rehearsed. Elena offered a polite murmur in response, her mind already wary. Her parents rarely reached out unless they needed something. Money for the antique shop, help covering Lana's art supplies, or a loan to rescue Callum's latest failing venture. And yet, some naive part of her still clung to hope. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe it really was about family. After all, she hadn't been home in nearly a year, buried in 12-hour surgeries and the cold sterility of hospital corridors. She longed, however foolishly, for a night where she didn't have to be Dr. Mercer, the miracle-working neurosurgeon, but simply Elena, the daughter. As the week wore on, her internal tug-of-war intensified. Memories of her childhood crept in, how she had been the responsible one, the helper, the fixer, while Callum and Lana basked in leniency. Still, when Friday came, she found herself packing a small bag and setting her GPS for the old farmhouse outside Asheville. As the sun dipped behind the Blue Ridge Mountains and golden light stretched across the winding roads, Elena told herself it was just dinner. One meal, one night, a chance to be part of something whole again. But deep down, a tight knot of unease was already forming in her gut, because when her mother called with kindness, there was always a price. The drive from Asheville to the Mercer farmhouse was one Elena had taken countless times before, yet this time felt heavier, as if the tires themselves sensed her reluctance. Winding through dense woods and rolling hills, the scenery was postcard perfect. Burnt orange leaves fluttering from the trees, the sun casting long golden streaks across the two-lane road. But the beauty only deepened the pit in her stomach. Her childhood home sat on 5 acres of inherited land, once vibrant with weekend bonfires, garden parties, and family barbecues. But those memories were brittle now, like faded photographs tucked away in a forgotten drawer. As a child, Elena had always been the one to rake the leaves, patch the screen doors, and help balance the checkbook when her mother overspent or when Callum crashed his car again. It wasn't just the chores, it was the way responsibility clung to her like a second skin, unasked but always expected. Beatrice often praised her publicly, our Elena, always so capable. But in private, her love was more transactional. Ray, her father, was less involved in the family dynamic, preferring silence over confrontation. He had mastered the art of quiet nods and vanishing behind newspaper pages when tension flared. As Elena's car crested the final hill, the familiar outline of the farmhouse appeared, white paint peeling, shutters askew, the porch swing still hanging by one chain. A dozen memories collided in her mind, sneaking out with flashlights, patching Lana's school project the night before it was due, writing checks behind closed doors to keep the electricity on. She parked slowly, staring at the house. A deep breath didn't calm her. Instead, it brought back the distinct smell of that old house, dust, varnish, and something faintly sour. Still, part of her hoped maybe things had changed. Maybe her siblings had grown. Maybe her parents had learned to see her as more than the one who fixes everything. She grabbed her bag and stepped out of the car, her heels crunching against gravel. The sun was setting fast, casting the entire house in shadow. An omen, perhaps, but she walked to the porch anyway. The scent of rosemary and roasted garlic wafted through the Mercer farmhouse as Elena stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the warm glow of amber light from the antique chandelier. The long wooden dining table was set with mismatched porcelain plates, vintage crystal glasses, and a steaming roast at the center. An elaborate display that felt less like a casual family gathering and more like a stage set for something rehearsed. Beatrice greeted her with a kiss on the cheek, a little too performative, while Ray nodded from his usual seat at the head of the table. Callum and Lana were already there, both grinning like they'd just won a game Elena didn't know she was playing. Lana twirled her hair absent-mindedly, her bright red nails tapping against her wine glass, while Callum sprawled back lazily, his phone peeking from his palm. For the first half hour, conversation was surface level and saccharine. Updates on Lana's upcoming art residency, which Elena suspected was just another online course, and Callum's new culinary project, likely another doomed food truck idea. Elena responded politely, sipping her wine, quietly noting how no one asked about her life. No one mentioned her recent published research, her promotion, or the fact she had just returned from a pediatric medical mission abroad. Then, the tone shifted. Beatrice cleared her throat, placing her napkin on her lap with great care. "Elena," she began sweetly, "we wanted to talk to you tonight as a family. Your father and I have finalized our estate plans." Elena froze mid-bite, sensing the air thicken. Ray chimed in flatly. "The house, the antiques, and the lake cabin in Boone? They'll go to Callum and Lana." Silence followed, hanging heavily in the air before Elena set her fork down. "Excuse me?" Her voice was calm, but her chest burned. Callum leaned forward smugly. "Come on, Elle, you don't need it. You're loaded. You've got that condo, your career, your investments." Lana shrugged, offering a sweet smile. "We just need a little help getting on our feet. You've always been the golden one." The words hit harder than she expected. Her parents watched her reaction with unsettling detachment. Elena inhaled sharply, her fingers curling around the edge of the table. "And the money I spent renovating this house? The $25,000 loan I paid off for you, Callum? The rent I covered for Lana for nearly 2 years?" Her mother waved a dismissive hand. "You were helping, darling. That's what family does." Beatrice smiled, as if the betrayal was a minor misunderstanding. "Besides, you always said you didn't care about money." Elena laughed bitterly. "I don't care about money. I care about fairness. I thought all of that was for the good of the family. I didn't realize I was just the family's financier." Lana rolled her eyes. "You're being dramatic. It's not like you're poor." Elena stared at them, stunned not by the decision but by the lack of remorse. Her father remained silent, his gaze fixed on his wine, not daring to meet hers. It wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about being erased, reduced to a resource, not a daughter. The careful dinner table, the flattering invitations, the cheerful voices, it had all been a setup. She'd been lured back not for love or reunion, but to be informed, without apology, that she no longer had a place in the legacy she helped sustain. The house she helped preserve, the cabin she helped maintain, the siblings she had carried, time and again. She looked around at the people she once called family and saw nothing but entitlement masked as kinship. Her appetite gone, her trust shattered, Elena leaned back and whispered, more to herself than anyone else, of course, it was never about love." The silence that followed Elena's quiet realization cracked like ice underfoot. She slowly stood from her chair, her voice firm but dangerously low. "Do you even hear yourselves?" she asked, eyes sweeping across the table. "You act like you're doing me a favor by cutting me out, as if I haven't kept this entire family afloat for over a decade." Callum scoffed. "Nobody asked you to, Elena. You just like playing the martyr." Lana snorted in agreement, her tone dripping with mock innocence. "Seriously, it's not our fault you chose to act like a hero. Don't blame us for your decisions." Elena's hands trembled as she gripped the back of her chair, her breath shallow with rage. "You're right," she said. "No one asked me. I just stepped in when the lights were about to be shut off, when your rent was overdue, when the cabin's roof was collapsing. I thought that's what family did, support each other. But I see now, it was always one way." Beatrice rose from her seat, arms folded tightly, eyes narrowed with cold authority. "That's enough, Elena. You're being ungrateful and petty. We're doing what's best for your siblings. They need a foundation." Elena turned sharply toward her. "No, Mom, you're doing what's easiest. You've always seen me as the fallback plan, the safety net, not a daughter." Her father opened his mouth as if to speak, but only sighed and looked away. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It had been slow, cumulative, built on years of silent expectations and unspoken debts. But now it stood in front of her, naked and undeniable. "You talk about foundations," Elena continued, her voice rising. "But what about mine? I passed on vacations, relationships, opportunities, because I was busy paying your debts. And now, after everything, you don't even think I deserve a place in the family legacy?" Lana smirked. "You've got your career. You don't need more." Elena looked at her sister, the girl who once begged her to co-sign a lease, who sent desperate texts at 2 a.m. asking for help. "And yet you need everything," she said bitterly, "and expect it handed to you." The room felt colder now, the candles flickering as if afraid of the truth being spoken. "You don't want a daughter," Elena said, her voice flat. "You want a wallet, and I'm done being that." The room fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the faint clink of cutlery and the low hum of the chandelier above. Elena stood motionless, her heart pounding in her ears, but her voice, when it came, was calm and final. "I came here hoping things had changed, that maybe this family had learned how to see me as more than a source of income." She turned her eyes toward each of them, searching for a flicker of remorse, anything, but all she saw were blank stares and thinly veiled annoyance. "But I see now, nothing has changed, and it never will." She stepped back from the table, pushing her chair in with quiet precision. Beatrice's voice cracked through the tension like a whip. "If you walk out that door, don't expect to be welcomed back." Elena paused, her hand on the doorknob, then turned and met her mother's glare with eyes as cold as steel. "I never felt welcome here in the first place." Without waiting for a reply, she opened the door and walked into the crisp night air, the heavy door creaking shut behind her like the final act of a long, painful play. As she descended the porch steps, her heels clicked softly against the worn wood, each step lighter than the last. The farmhouse, once a place she had desperately wanted to belong to, now loomed behind her like a relic of a past she no longer needed. The sharp autumn wind bit at her cheeks, but she didn't flinch. For the first time in years, she felt untethered. Not lost, but free. Sliding into her car, she sat for a moment, letting the silence wrap around her. She took a deep breath, and with it, she exhaled the years of guilt, obligation, and sacrifice that had chained her to people who only saw her value in dollars. The engine purred to life, and as she drove back toward Asheville, the trees blurred into streaks of amber and charcoal. The house faded into the distance behind her, but not the resolve. She wasn't just walking away from a dinner. She was walking away from a lifetime of being taken for granted. Back in the stillness of her Asheville apartment, Elena dropped her keys into the ceramic bowl by the door and stood in silence, the familiar hum of the city outside her window grounding her. The warmth of her home, the space she had built entirely on her own, felt different now, like a shield rather than a sanctuary. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat at the kitchen table, her eyes scanning the room but her mind miles away. Then, almost on instinct, she reached for her laptop and opened her banking app. Dozens of transactions blinked back at her. Monthly payments to her parents' joint account, utilities tied to the farmhouse, transfers labeled Lana, emergency, Callum, loan, and family expenses. Her throat tightened, not with sorrow but with clarity. She hovered over each recurring payment, her fingers steady as she tapped cancel one by one. With every confirmation, it felt as though a brick was being lifted from her chest. When the final screen flashed, Successfully canceled, Elena leaned back in her chair, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for years. No more quiet withdrawals from her future to fund their irresponsibility. No more guilt-ridden texts from her mother. No more last-minute cash transfers to bail Callum out of a failed business idea or cover Lana's overdue credit card bill. She wasn't abandoning them. She was reclaiming herself. Her phone buzzed on the table, but she didn't look. She reached instead for a pen and began writing down her own goals. Small dreams she had pushed aside for years. A photography course. A solo trip to Portugal. A new investment in herself. For the first time, her future didn't revolve around anyone else's needs. She wasn't just cutting financial ties, she was drawing emotional boundaries that had never existed before. And as the night deepened and city lights flickered through her window, Elena realized that the most generous thing she'd ever do for her family was walk away, and the most powerful thing she'd ever do for herself was not look back. The backlash began the very next morning. Elena awoke to a barrage of missed calls, voicemails, and frantic texts, first from her mother, then Callum, then Lana. At first, she didn't check them. She already knew what they'd say. But curiosity won, and as she sipped her coffee, she pressed play on the first message. Elena, Beatrice's voice hissed through the speaker, already laced with disappointment. "I can't believe you would do something so drastic. You're really going to punish your family over a few legal documents?" The second message was more aggressive. Callum, furious. "Are you serious? You cut us off? Do you know how much pressure we're under?" "This is childish and selfish." Text after text flooded in. Lana, true to form, played the victim. "You've destroyed the family, Elena. Congratulations. Hope your money keeps you warm at night." Elena stared at her phone, both disturbed and oddly calm. None of them apologized. None asked how she felt. They weren't upset that she was hurt. They were angry she had stopped serving them. Later that afternoon, Elena returned to her apartment to find something strange. Her front door was sealed shut, thick with dried white foam expanding from every crevice, hardened like cement. She froze, heart thudding. Someone had sabotaged her home. Her stomach twisted as she rushed to check her security camera app. Rewinding the footage, she spotted a figure in a hoodie and baseball cap slinking up to her door. The angle didn't lie. Callum. His gait, the way he tilted his head with smug satisfaction as he emptied the can into her lock, it was unmistakable. Hands trembling but jaw tight, Elena snapped clear screenshots and called the police. When the officer arrived, Elena was composed. She presented the evidence calmly, clearly, professionally. "Would you like to press charges?" the officer asked, almost as if hoping she'd decline. She met his eyes without flinching. "Absolutely." Later that night, her father called. "Elena, sweetheart, does it really have to go this far?" She answered coldly, "It already has." When he asked what it would take to make it go away, she didn't hesitate. $33,000? Repairs, legal fees, emotional damages? Or Callum gets a criminal record. The next morning, the money was in her account. No apology, no acknowledgement, but that wasn't what she needed. For the first time, they had been forced to pay for the damage they caused, and for the first time, Elena didn't feel like the one being punished for speaking up. She felt powerful. The money arrived with chilling silence. No call, no apology, no explanation. Just a cold transfer from her parents' joint account, labeled "for damages." Elena stared at the notification, her heart steady, not triumphant but certain. They thought money would shut her up, erase the shame and reset the power dynamic. But what they didn't understand was that this time Elena wasn't buying back peace, she was enforcing consequences. She opened her laptop and, for the first time in years, logged into Facebook with a purpose. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard only briefly before she began typing. Her words sharp, deliberate, and impossible to twist. For over a decade, I supported my family financially. Mortgages, medical bills, student loans. I gave because I loved them. But when they finalized their will and left me nothing, they told me it was because I didn't need it. When I protested, they called me selfish. When I stopped paying, they called me heartless. And when my brother vandalized my home, I pressed charges. Not out of spite, out of necessity. The post went live and spread like wildfire. Within hours, it had been shared hundreds of times. Supportive comments flooded in, others who had lived through similar exploitation, who saw themselves in her words. Of course, there was criticism too. Some chided her for making family matters public. But Elena didn't care. She hadn't posted for sympathy. She had posted to reclaim her voice. When Beatrice finally called, her voice was venom wrapped in outrage. "What the hell do you think you're doing? You're ruining this family's name." Elena responded coolly, "No, Mom, I'm just telling the truth. You ruined it the day you decided my only value was what I could give you." She ended the call without waiting for a reply. And this time, she didn't feel guilt. She felt stillness, peace. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was clean. No more manipulation, no more emotional blackmail. They could fume, threaten, twist the story however they wanted, but they no longer had access to her. And for the first time in her life, that boundary wasn't just emotional. It was final. In the weeks that followed, Elena found herself waking up without the usual weight pressing down on her chest. The silence, once unsettling, had become a balm. A kind of emotional quiet she didn't know she'd been craving. With no late-night emergency calls, no draining financial crises to solve, and no guilt clouding her every move, she began to live, not just exist. She enrolled in a weekend photography course, something she'd put off for years because it felt frivolous compared to all the responsibilities that used to consume her. One Saturday, while hiking with her class along the Blue Ridge Parkway, she met Miles Hammond, a calm-voiced nature photographer, who carried both his camera and his kindness like second skin. Their first conversation wasn't dramatic, it was simple. He asked about the light she was trying to capture. She told him about the weight she had just released, and instead of recoiling or giving unsolicited advice, he just listened. With Miles, there were no demands, no masked expectations, only warmth, curiosity, and shared moments of silence that felt meaningful rather than empty. For the first time, Elena didn't feel the need to prove her worth. She didn't have to be impressive. She just had to be present. The bond grew slowly, like ivy on old stone, quiet but resilient. She started traveling on her off days, visiting the places she'd once only seen in calendars: Paris, Kyoto, Patagonia. Each new stamp in her passport felt like a small rebellion against the life that had kept her caged for so long. Her camera became a companion, a way to frame beauty on her own terms. And though the scars of her family's betrayal still lingered beneath the surface, they no longer dictated her path. Elena was healing, not because someone saved her, but because she finally chose herself. A year later, standing on the balcony of her Asheville apartment with a cup of tea warming her hands, Elena watched the morning fog roll over the mountains. The city below buzzed gently with life, but inside her, everything was still. Peacefully, powerfully still. News of her family had trickled in through mutual acquaintances. Her mother's antique shop had quietly shut down months ago, and Beatrice was now waitressing at a roadside diner, no longer the poised matriarch who barked orders, but a woman learning, perhaps too late, what self-reliance really meant. Ray had taken part-time work at a hardware store, his quietness now edged with wariness. Colum was drifting, jobless and bitter, while Lana bounced between social media gigs, no longer funded by Elena's invisible support. And yet, despite it all, Elena felt no guilt. Not out of cruelty. She had given them chances more than anyone ever should, and they had chosen to exploit, not cherish. Walking away hadn't been a loss. It had been a liberation. Her life now was hers alone, built not from duty but desire. She thought back to that dinner, the chandelier, the roast, the betrayal, and felt only distance. That version of her, the one who begged to be seen, was gone. In her place stood a woman who no longer needed validation from the people who once drained her. Behind her, Miles stirred from bed, calling her softly, and she smiled, not because she was saved, but because she was seen. Truly seen. The inheritance she never received? It no longer mattered. The true gift had been cutting ties. Losing her family had given her back her life, and as the sun broke through the clouds, Elena stepped back inside, finally, beautifully whole. The story of Elena Mercer teaches a powerful lesson about self-worth, boundaries, and the courage to walk away from toxic family dynamics. For years, Elena sacrificed her own dreams, finances, and emotional well-being to support a family that only valued her for what she could provide, not for who she was. Her love was unconditional, but their affection was transactional. When she finally stood up for herself, she was met with anger, manipulation, and betrayal. But in choosing to sever those ties, Elena didn't lose a family. She reclaimed her freedom. The lesson is clear. Setting boundaries is not selfish, it's survival. Being loyal to people who drain you is not love, and sometimes the most empowering thing you can do is say enough. Elena's journey proves that family isn't defined by blood, but by respect, honesty, and reciprocity. Walking away may be painful, but staying in relationships that diminish your value is far worse. In choosing herself, Elena didn't just escape a cycle of exploitation. She discovered peace, healing, and a life where love is freely given, not earned through sacrifice. This story is a reminder that you are not obligated to keep people in your life who only take from you.